Thank you all very much for coming out today. My name is Andy Ellis. I'm the co-chair of the Maryland Green Party. And so first off, thank you all for filling the space today. I appreciate it. Second thing is, we are in the function co-working space right now, and I want to thank Jean and Lisa, who are the owners of this space, for giving us the opportunity to host this important public meeting right here in this space. So thank you to Jean. Now, some housekeeping things first before we get started. There are two gender-neutral restrooms right there, one here and one there, and they say what plumbing is in the room that you're going to be using, so you can choose that way. The second thing is there's a water bottle filler right over there, and if you have a water bottle, you can use it at the drinking fountain. The third thing, and I want to say, is note the art on the wall. The art on the wall is from a local artist named Jordan Tierney, and the show just started yesterday. So if you see anything that you like, Jean has a catalog of it in the back, but otherwise just enjoy it, take a look, and appreciate the value of local art and local community coming together in a space like this, where people from all over the neighborhood and all over Northeast Baltimore come to convene, come to enjoy art, come to have meetings, and come to expand their imagination of what is possible. So I'm really excited today to kick off the series of Maryland Green Party policy conversations and visions of what the world may look like 10 years from now in the 2030s, after a decade of solid organizing. What we have today is we have Owen Silverman Andrews, co-chair of the Baltimore City Green Party, is going to be presenting his vision of what a Green New Deal might look like. Earlier this year, the Maryland Green Party decided to adopt our own version of what a Maryland Green New Deal would be for the 2020s and for the 2020s, and this is the first step of that. For the end of this year, we'll be approving a platform plank that includes many of these things, but also includes things that come from suggestions that come from all of you. And we believe that it is a plan that we can take forward, that we can advocate in public, that our candidates can use, and that we can help contribute to the public conversation so that one of the most important crises facing us today can be addressed with a solid plan that is up to the challenge that we face. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Owen. Afterwards, we'll have some questions and answers, and then there'll be some time for people to mingle and just talk after that. Great? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Andy. As Andy mentioned, I'm Owen Silverman Andrews. I'm the co-chair of the Baltimore City Green Party. Thank you all so much for being here. And I'm thinking of two words to describe how I'm feeling. I'm feeling really energized that all of you powerful people have come together to be with us during this really critical moment. And I'm also feeling terrified about what will happen if we don't use that collective power that we have in this room, that we know is outside of this room, in communities with folks who weren't able to be here today, to use the 2020s as a decade where we shift our politics in the state of Maryland away from the current binary of two parties funded by the fossil fuels and the climate destroyers, into a politics where new things are possible that we're struggling to even imagine right now. And so some of the things that we'll be presenting now in 2019, when we look back on this 10 years from now, will seem like, oh, that's the best they could do, right? But we're trying to expand our political imaginations. We're trying to move the conversation beyond what people think is possible right now. And if we can do that, and we can do the grassroots organizing to make these conversations turn into realities and transform into policies that impact people's lives, then we're on the right track. So the three things that I really want you all to walk away with, if you remember nothing else from our conversation today, besides this is a great space and we should come back here. The first thing that I really want you to remember is that we are facing a monumental crisis that has been going on. It's not a future crisis, it's been going on in our communities for a long, long time now, especially communities of color, especially working class communities. The climate crisis has been here and has already killed and taken lives and destroyed lives for many years now. So the climate crisis is real, it's impacting all facets of our society, and they don't have a solution for it. And when I say they, I mean the folks who have the power to change things and have had that power for a long time and haven't acted best interests of working class people and other marginalized communities. So we're facing a crisis, and they don't have the answer, and even if they did, they're unwilling to act on it. That's the first thing that I really want you to remember. Second thing I want you to remember is we do have an answer, right? You'll see some of the answers in this plan today. Other folks who have come here have long track records of really everyone, as I'm looking around, have track records of amazing community activism, and we want to build a political party that empowers you instead of putting you in a clientelistic position where you're begging for your issue to be addressed by the folks who have power in City Hall or Annapolis or DC. So we have a plan, and your aspirations, the work that you've done, are part of that plan, even if you don't hear them mentioned specifically today in the framework. What you've done is part of this plan as well. And the third thing I want you to remember is how we get there, how we go from having a plan and a vision for the 20s and a vision for where we want to be in 2030 to having that implemented and being a reality. And that requires changing the politics of Maryland in a structural way, not just electing new faces into positions of power, but actually shifting power away from the folks and the institutions that have had it for so long and towards new iterations of community-based power that are accountable to working class communities, marginalized communities, communities of color. So the first question that I want to really address is related to that first point of why, if we live in a state that has a Democratic majority, that has the ability to override a governor's veto in Annapolis, why, if we live in a city where 100% of the city council members, as well as all of the citywide positions, are held by Democrats, why do we not have current solutions being implemented that are sufficient to the scale of the crisis we're facing? And I think it really breaks down into three reasons. And this is not just directed at Democrats, this is also true of Republicans and other parties as well. But the first reason that we don't have the solutions in place right now that we need, and we're nowhere near having those solutions in place despite amazing activism and organizing and advocacy by folks from a wide spectrum of movements, is the donor base, right? Over the past few decades, but really throughout U.S. history, money has been constant, and when wealth especially has been concentrated in the hands of a very few number of people. And those people can turn around and write a $6,000 check and not think about it twice, and that's more than many families make in several months. So the fact that the donor base is doing just fine under the current system is the first reason that neither of the fossil fuel funded parties is willing to implement structural changes to move our economy and our state away from dependency on climate and environmental destroying policies towards one of the future that we're going to describe here today. So it's the donor base. The second is their track record, right? So for decades, the state, really almost the entire history of the state of Maryland, has been controlled by one party. And they have a long legacy to protect. And people, once they get into positions of power, it changes them. And I think the fact that they have been addressing the crises that we face in our communities in an insufficient way for many years is kind of a vicious cycle, and it means that they're unwilling to do something different because it'll point to the fact that for so long they weren't doing enough. And so I think the track records of the people who hold power in City Hall, who hold power in Annapolis, is one of the fundamental stumbling blocks why we don't have the politics that we need and the policies that we need to empower people to survive the climate crisis that's already happening. And the third reason is their understanding of change, right? And this could seem a little kind of out there in the ether, but what I mean by that is that if you look at the history of this country, change has come when power has been built outside of the two elite-dominated parties, right? It happened in the 1850s when the radical Republicans were invested in the emancipation effort and brought that effort into fruition. They were outside the binary of the Whigs and the Democrats. It happened during the women's suffrage movement. The first parties to put women's issues forward were always third parties, and later it was co-opted by the Democratic Party and Woodrow Wilson. And it happened during the New Deal, right? So we're talking about a Green New Deal, but to really understand the history of the original New Deal, you have to look at the power that was built outside of the Democratic Party, the Socialist Party especially, that pushed FDR to implement elements of their platform. And so if we have this understanding of change and they have a different understanding, a more top-down understanding of how change happens, that's the third reason why that we don't have the politics that we need now, and why the people who have power now are incapable of bringing it to us. And so the question becomes, where do we go from here? Right? We have a decent understanding of the scale of the crisis we face. You all are living it every day. You all are reading it every day in the news. This is not an abstract thing that has to do with your thermometer 20 years from now, right? This has to do with violent weather patterns which are killing people right now. This has to do with mold in people's basements, lead paint in people's walls that are killing people right now and causing violence across Baltimore and across the state of Maryland. So the first plank of this new vision, this new framework for a Maryland Green New Deal, without which all of the other parts face longer odds, is grassroots democracy. One of the reasons why we don't have the politics we need is because our political system isn't just broken, it was designed to concentrate power in a very few number of hands and keep it there. And so if we want to address that, and we want to address the climate crisis and other crises that we're facing, we need to change our politics. We need to establish a truer democracy. And there are several steps that we can take in the next General Assembly session in 2020, or at least advocate for. And there are things that people in City Hall could be doing right now. This is not some far-off set of policies that maybe someone could implement if only they had the will. These are things that we can be advocating for right now, which will create momentum for the bigger things that we want to see to help us get to the place where we need to be by 2030. And so the first one of those is just like when you go to, well, hopefully you don't buy a pack of cigarettes, but if someone does buy a pack of cigarettes, no shame if you do. I struggle with addiction as well. But if you see a pack of cigarettes and it says, you know, warning, these will kill you, we should have the same kind of warning on all campaign literature that's funded by fossil fuels companies and other climate destroyers, right? Anyone who takes a check, any politician who takes a check and thinks that whether because they agree with them or for political expediency, that they can get into power and get into office on the backs of the dollars coming from the folks who are endangering the livability of our communities, we need a warning to let us know what's happening. The second thing we need to do, it's a little bit more far-reaching, but we're already seeing good momentum across the state of Maryland and here in Baltimore City, is we need to equitably publicly finance our state elections so that the dollars, the hard-earned dollars of working-class people resonate just as much, if not more, than the dollars of the millionaires and the billionaires who have corrupted our politics. And so if we can have an equitable public financing for all public offices in the state of Maryland, then we stand a fighting chance of getting people into office who are beholden to their voters and their constituents and not to their major donors. So the next piece of it is, goes along with that, we need to curtail pay-to-play politics, right? So there's been one scandal after another in Baltimore City, and the media treats that in a certain way because of racism. The same scandals are happening in the suburbs. They're a little bit different. They have to do with developers and suburban sprawl, and the same thing is happening there. It's just people get caught with their hand in the cookie jar in a different way, and we really need to end those pay-to-play politics. And there's a number of policies that folks have articulated that speak to that. We're not going to go into too much detail there. Where do we want to be by 2030? The question is, right now, we have a binary, which is really not a binary in the state of Maryland. We're a state that's been controlled by one party for almost its entire history in terms of the General Assembly, except for a few years, mostly 100 years ago, when the Republicans had control of the General Assembly. So where do we want to be by 2030? We want to have a thriving multi-party democracy where the elected officials are accountable to the left flank of the state of Maryland, right? We have a state where recently a poll came out and showed 30% of people have a positive or a very positive view of socialism. Why isn't that manifested in our politics? Because we have a binary in which people are stuck between bad and worse when it comes to the leadership of the two major parties. And so we need to move towards a truer democracy where working class people have a real voice. The second piece, and this is really, really important, I almost didn't put it second, but I think we need to establish the vehicle, the truer democracy that gets us to the next stop, the next plank in the framework, and that's social and racial justice. So I think that many, not all, but many of the more traditional environmentalists who are disproportionately middle class, who are disproportionately white and suburban, have set us back decades in addressing the climate crisis by not centering social and racial justice in their climate advocacy and in their policies, right? We cannot have climate justice if we do not have racial justice. We cannot have climate justice if we do not have class justice, and ecofeminism has to be a central part of any Maryland Green New Deal proposal. So I think we need to think of this Maryland Green New Deal as an intersectional set of policies that empower people who have been marginalized over time, and not another kind of suburban white middle class feel-good environmental bill, because that has failed and that has played into the hands of politicians who like to play divide and conquer and put people whose number one issue is the environment over here and put people who are dying because of the climate crisis over here. So what does that actually mean in terms of the vision for the next year and the beginning of the 2020s? It means that we need a jobs guarantee, right? We don't need a jobs program. We don't need jobs training. We need to have a jobs guarantee so that anyone who wants a job in West Baltimore, in East Baltimore, in Western Maryland, and the Eastern Shore has access to a job in their community where they are either addressing remediating lead paint in Baltimore's Black Butterfly, or cleaning up brownfield sites across the state of Maryland that have been caused by climate polluters, destroyers, and deniers. And so if we can have a Maryland Environmental Neighborhood Defense Corps that it acts as a jobs guarantee, so that people are working in their communities where they know the lay of the land, they're setting their priorities, but the funding is coming from the state level. That's the first step we have in really connecting social and racial justice to climate justice. The second piece that we need to have, which is connected to that, is bottom-up climate resiliency, right? So we need to have people who are closest to the problem in their communities, who understand how climate apartheid and climate injustice are affecting their communities. They need to be shaping policy at the local level. They need to be shaping budgets at the local level in order for us to have climate resiliency that allows these communities to continue to be livable. And some of them are currently not livable when we think about things like rates of asthma and lead poisoning and other diseases that are a direct result of climate apartheid in Baltimore and across the state of Maryland. And the third piece is reparations, period, right? So we cannot have climate justice if we do not pay back the communities whose wealth has been sucked out of them, if we do not pay back the communities who have been harmed by the state. We cannot have climate justice, and we cannot have social justice, and we cannot have racial justice. So there are people sometimes say that, oh, Baltimore is a poor city, or Baltimore has poor neighborhoods, or Baltimore has disinvested neighborhoods. That's a little bit better. It's not true. We have neighborhoods that have been robbed blind, right? We have neighborhoods that have been robbed blind by corporations, by the Gun Trace Task Force, by developers, right? The wealth has been sucked out of these neighborhoods, and we need to pay it back. It's not a handout, it's paying back the money that's been stolen from these neighborhoods historically, going back to the stealing of this land from Native people through slavery and into the modern Jim Crow and in other ways. So we need reparations as a central plank of the Maryland Green New Deal. Where does that leave us? Where does that leave us when we look at the 2030 vision? We have in 2030, if we're able to implement the Maryland Green New Deal and change our politics, we have a society where communities that have been traditionally marginalized are empowered in the political process and are empowered economically, so that we have a more democratic economic system that doesn't pit one person off against another like crabs in a barrel, but where we're working together to build community wealth at the local level and at the state level. So the third piece that's really, really essential, and I think is another thing that's been left out of the traditional framework and the traditional narrative of environmental policies, is nonviolence, right? So we cannot have a Maryland Green New Deal if we don't address the violence in our communities. And that's a circular violence, right? So when we think about the root causes of violence, when we think about the lead poisoning and the air poisoning and the water poisoning that's happening in Baltimore and across the state of Maryland, that's one of, not the only, but it's one of the root causes of the violence that we see. And if we can address the environmental apartheid and the climate apartheid of our communities, then that will also lead to, in the medium term, addressing the violence in our communities. What does that look like in the short term, the next few years? What do we want to see in the 20s? We want to enact strict controls on the pollution that is a result of the firing ranges and the weapons testing facilities at military bases and arsenals across the state of Maryland. These other states around the country have begun to get savvy to this and are picking up on the pollution that's seeping into the water from weapons and shooting ranges, and are starting to enact strict guidelines to protect communities against them. And so Maryland has a huge military carbon footprint. And while at the state level we can't slash the military's budget, we can enact standards on the degradation to reverse and address the degradation that those military bases are having at the state level. We can also divert funding from enforcement and incarceration, because while we have the military at the local level, we have a militarized police force. We can divert funding from enforcement and incarceration to mediation and peace building. And this is very much part and parcel of climate justice, right? The patrolling that goes on by the Baltimore police is a huge waste of resources. And communities, when you talk to them, many of them want to see people walking the beat. And we really need to downgrade the fleet of the Baltimore police force as a very short-term step. So this works at a state level with the federal military, but it also works at the local level with the DPD military. And we also need to end tax breaks for corporate arms dealers. So Lockheed Martin and other arms dealers are receiving huge corporate tax breaks to do nothing except continue to make millions of dollars in our state. And so we need to end those tax breaks, and that's an essential source of funding for some of the policies that are laid out in the Maryland Green New Deal. Where does that leave us in 2030? It leaves us with grassroots peacekeeping coming from the individual level, from the household level, the community level, up, out onto the societal level of Maryland. And we have a more peaceful and just society that is also more environmentally just. Lastly, and this is the one that often people associate with the Green Party, is ecological wisdom. So I think there's a key distinction to be made between environmentalism and a core value of ecological wisdom. Ecological wisdom means that we understand our place in the world as a species, and we understand we're living on a planet with limited, finite resources, and the continued growth that our species is living and enacting around the world is unsustainable, and that needs to be changed fundamentally if we're to restore our species balance with the natural world. What does that look like in the short term? It means we need 100% renewable energy in the state of Maryland, truly renewable energy. So we have recently they enacted a 50% renewable energy portfolio, and that portfolio is not all renewable. We know that, and it reminds me of that little video. I don't know if anyone has seen it, where there's the woman on the beach and she has the broom and she's pushing water back into the ocean. I mean, that's what they're doing. That's the scale of the problem we're facing, and those are the tools that they're using to address it. So 50% is not only a half solution, it's a non-solution, because it kicks the can further down the road. It allows politicians and the centrist environmental organizations to notch another win on their belt without actually addressing the problem of climate crisis in a fundamental way. We also need to set a moratorium on all new fossil fuel infrastructure, right? Counties and cities around the country are already doing this. So there's a huge debate in this neighborhood about a new Royal Farms. There should be no new gas stations anywhere in the state. We know that this is, it's like giving a patient with lung cancer another pack of cigarettes every time we open up a new gas station. So we need a moratorium on any new fossil fuel infrastructure on the state. and we need to begin that transition to a green future by the means that are necessary. And so that means using the power of the state in the form of eminent domain, just as the state used eminent domain to seize homes of mostly black people in the Middle East in order for Johns Hopkins to build a park and a playground for their employees. We need to use the power of eminent domain to seize any fossil fuels infrastructure that is not converted to renewable energy sources by 2032 at the very latest. Where does that leave us in 2030? It leaves us with an economy that's powered not by endless growth, but by boundless equity. It leaves us with an economy and a society where movement, transportation is a right and not a privilege of the few, where getting from where you live to where you need to go is a social good that's provided by the society, and that every member of the society has a right to and doesn't have to wait for 3 buses in order to get to a decent paying job, if at all. And so that's the vision of where we'll be in 2030 if we enact the Maryland Green New Deal. So you've stuck with me through the first 4 planks of the framework. Thank you so much. The next piece is a review kind of what we talked about in the beginning of how we get there, right? So we have an idea of some of the framework. There are a lot more policies that need to be filled in by all of you and folks in your communities and folks who aren't represented here. But the question is, regardless of what we come up with in the final legislative outline of the Maryland Green New Deal, we need to understand how we get this enacted. And I think we're in a really pivotal moment because there are progressive Democrats who are starting to use the language of the Maryland Green New Deal. And we know that the Green Party in New York in 2009 and across the country in 2010 were the first ones to put forward a Green New Deal platform in the United States. And we know that the Maryland Green New Party put forward a Green New Deal platform in 2014, like 5 years ago. But some people are starting to catch on to the messaging, and to me that's a partial victory, that they're at least willing to acknowledge that the scale of the crisis we face requires a mobilization similar to defeating fascism in World War II and defeating the Great Depression. That's a start. But we know that we can't get there unless we mobilize the same kind of power, working class power, that the Socialist Party mobilized in the 1930s to force FDR to enact elements of the Green New Deal. And we know we have to remain vigilant after it's enacted, because look at what happened to the Socialist Party and the organized electoral left in the United States in the 1950s and afterwards, right? So how do we get there? We build electoral power outside of the fossil fuel powered political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, and we move this project forward on terms that are not willing to compromise with the livability of our communities and say, oh, well, your communities can be 50% livable by 2030. No, we need 100% livable communities, and we need to take action now if we're to have a future in Maryland at all. So I think that kind of lays the framework for what we need to do and how we need to get there. And I think at that point, we'll have a 2020s that is really rich with people's power and in which we kind of change the top-down nature of our economy and our politics towards one that really supports the resiliency and community love of folks around the state.
All right. Well, thank you, Owen. That's a